I want to take you to Mississippi now and the backlash from equal rights groups and big businesses to this one-day-old law now allowing churches and charities and businesses and even state officials the right to refuse services based on religious grounds to gay people and to transgender people. The governor says the legislation is meant to protect religious freedom, but the critics say it's just a blanket allowance for discrimination against the LGBT community. And it comes as pressure grows to repeal something similar in North Carolina, a law that requires transgender people in that state to use public restrooms that correspond with the sex that's listed on their birth certificates and not the sex that they identify with. Jeffrey Toobin is back with me now. So I want to ask you a little bit about what the rationale is for this. We all understand where the religious freedom folks stand and where those critics stand. But then there's the law. And a state law can't be in contravention to a federal law. But to most people it would seem it is. Why is that not so?
Well, because under federal law, under the United States Constitution, the status of gay people is not entirely settled. Let me give you an example. It is quite clear that if Mississippi were to pass a law that said businesses on religious grounds have the right to refuse service to black people, clearly unconstitutional, because the Supreme Court has said that African Americans, that racial minorities are a class that cannot be discriminated against. They have never exactly said that about gay people. Now, the same-sex marriage case suggests that that's the case, but the court has never actually said that you can't discriminate against gay people under the Constitution. So this law, it may be unwise, it may be bigoted, it may be counterproductive, but it may also be constitutional.
So constitutional until there might at some point down the road be an amendment. But I want to read
not
for
necessarily,
you
not necessarily an amendment, a court case. The Supreme Court may say that you can't discriminate against gay people, but they haven't said that yet.
Or to make them a protected part of the protected classes.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
So the statement from Mississippi Governor Phil Bryant says this, and I'll paraphrase slightly, but this legislation does not challenge federal law. It, quote, even those laws which are in conflict with Mississippi's Constitution, and it reinforces First Amendment rights. I always wonder about First Amendment rights versus 14th Amendment, your equal protection. Why doesn't equal protection sort of jump in and give them the cover that the LGBT community would need?
Well, because under the 14th Amendment, the Supreme Court has never said that discrimination against gay people is prohibited. That's the issue with the 14th Amendment. And the First Amendment does allow you to associate with whoever you want to, and it allows you to have freedom of belief. But the question raised by this case is, may your beliefs entitle you to discriminate against gay people? And the Supreme Court has never settled that question, but there are so many of these laws coming on the books that these cases are almost guaranteed. Now, of course, there's the whole political and commercial issue of, PayPal saying they will not open a plant in North Carolina because they don't want to be associated in a state that has these kind of laws. That's not a legal issue, that's a political and a business issue.
That's just the free market's reaction. It's not just that state either. There's been a lot of reaction to both Mississippi and North Carolina. I think there's over 100 companies now that have joined the list, and a couple of states as well within their jurisdictions. Some of them have said we won't allow any government-sponsored travel to these states unless it's absolutely necessary.
Well, and if you remember last year, Indiana passed a similar kind of law, which critics called, a license to discriminate law, and the corporate reaction was so extreme and so immediate that Indiana backed down and changed that law almost entirely. North Carolina shows no sign of backing down, and Mississippi just passed the law yesterday. So, we're going to see whether the backlash moves either of those states to modify or overturn their laws.
There was one other piece of language, and I'm going to have to paraphrase it, but it's odd. It stood out to me as something that might actually generate more interest from those who otherwise might have dismissed this or felt that they had any connection to this particular legislation. The law in Mississippi protects from discrimination claims from anyone who believes that marriage is between one man and one woman. So if the cake baker doesn't want to bake a cake for a same-sex marriage, they get the protection from a discrimination lawsuit. And then there's this, and that sexual relations are reserved solely for marriage. So I wasn't aware of that until I just happened to notice it today. Does that mean that cake baker could refuse a couple that just lives together to bake a cake for someone who just lives together?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's
Why is that
exactly
not
what it
making
means.
bigger headlines? Because that affects millions and millions of people. I think a lot of people are sort of beyond the whole you can't have sex before you're married issue.
Well, I think, you know, first of all, this law just passed, and it was brought up very quickly. And, you know, this law, the Mississippi law, makes the other laws look tiny just because of the kind of the provisions you're talking about, and also the number of people and institutions that are allowed to discriminate under the Mississippi law. It's every business in the state. It's every church. It's every it's the government itself. So the breadth of this law is really extraordinary, far greater than the North Carolina law or even the Indiana law that was overturned. So, you know, I think you're right to point out what an extreme version of the law is, but, you know, this is what the legislators wanted. I mean, it wasn't a mistake.
It's super fascinating, and there's already litigation that's been launched. The ACLU is hot and heavy on this trail, so I think, you know, without question, this is going to be the kind of thing that we watch in the next year or two as being settled through the courts. Absolutely. And it'll be a fascinating watch. Jeff, you're always great. You always have the great answers. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
All righty.